Well, hello again, my farmtastic friends. Farmer Phil here, introducing this week's podcast. We're out in the garden again this week. It is that time of year, you know. And right next to the garden is our Asian pear tree. And it's just starting to bloom. And what a stench. I don't know if you've ever smelt Asian pear blooms. They are absolutely horrible. But we noticed, the kids and I, all kinds of different pollinators on there. There must have been at least 7 or 8 different pollinators, happy as could be, buzzing away and stealing pollen and bringing it to another flower and taking it back to the hive. And there were wild mason bees there, little emerald green bees, and seeing how the stench of these flowers is just so strong. They were also attracting pollinating flies. And then we turned our heads to look at the neighbors and took great delight at him on the verge of hyperventilating at the sight of all the dandelions popping up in his lawn. Meanwhile, Stephanie takes great pride in a very, very diverse lawn here at home. We've got the white clover, bird's foot, trefoil. We got thyme in there. What a beautiful smell when the lawn gets cut because of the thyme. So I don't know if you've clued in yet, but this week's subject is all about pollinators. And they're going to be interviewing some crazy guy from Il Perrot. I think he knows what he's talking about. Yours truly has been interviewed for this week's podcast. But before we get to that, we got to have this beautiful intro music played. Enjoy.
Welcome to the Farm to Food podcast. I'm Hugh Maynard, publisher of the Gleaner newspaper, the team that brings you this podcast every 2 weeks. The Farm to Food podcast is presented to you by Desjardins and also supported by the Livestock Breeders Association and Quinn Farm. The theme of this episode is bees, and not just the insect part, but the important role that bees play in ensuring a wide range of farm products make it onto our tables. Of course, we're talking about pollination, which produces honey, but is also essential to the production of many fruits and vegetables. Without bees and bumblebees, many other sorts of wild bees, there are no apples in the fall, and bees have been battling a number of challenges from pesticides to parasites to climate change that pose a threat to their beneficial role in food production. So, let's take a deep dive into how bees help feed the world. Regular listeners to our podcast are familiar with farmer Phil Quinn, who opens up each episode with a reflection from his years of working at Quinn Farm on Il Perrot. And while we could talk to Phil about any number of subjects, he's particularly passionate and knowledgeable about bees. So our producer, Jackie Rourke, recently paid a visit to Quinn Farm with some grandchildren in tow to talk to Phil about his bees.
So, Farmer Phil Quinn, your story with bees goes back how far? Like, how old were you when you started learning about and working with bees?
Oh, goodness. Dad had bees a few years before I was born. He was at Mac, a technician in the greenhouses there at Mac. And I forget the name of the prof who was the entomologist, the chief entomologist on campus there. He had a swarm up in a tree, and he said to Dad always had a pair of pruners on him, and he says, "You and your pruners come with me now." And he had a cardboard box and a ladder, and he said, "You're going to take the cardboard box, you're going to go up there on the ladder and just cut the branch and shake the bees into the box." And Dad had zero experience with bees. He was terrified. So then he just fell in love with bees and started learning all about it. And one of the first things he did here on the farm was to plant strawberries and sweet corn and have bees.
Is having bees with farmers a new thing, or because of the population's kind of diminishing, or have farmers long had bees to ensure that their crops get pollinated?
If you're looking at any kind of fruit production or vegetable production, yes, bees are important to have around. And they were pretty well at their lowest through the 80s, early 90s. Pesticides, insecticides particularly, were used broad spectrum, and they were quite harsh. And now we're learning to do a whole lot more integrated pest management and be a whole lot smarter with the products we're using. Use more specific products to the insects we're targeting and try and stay away from anything that'll be detrimental to any bees. And we're trying to give a whole lot more habitat to both our bees and indigenous bees that are in our environment. More on that, we have another very passionate entomologist from McGill that comes in every spring and does a head count on all of the indigenous bees that we have here on the farm, or wild bees. And we're over 40 indigenous or native pollinators, aside from our honeybees. The little teeny tiny microscopic wasps that are emerald green. There are mason bees that have their nests in the ground. All kinds of pollinators if you just give them a chance, give them a habitat and stop using insecticides in an unresponsible way.
How hard is it to start having bees, and how much of an expert do you need to be to have bees? Because there's a certain amount of danger involved, is there?
There can be, for sure. If you attempt to get into the hive on a day where conditions are not right, you're gonna find out real quick. You can lose a pile of money getting into bees. It's quite expensive for the equipment, and I would highly suggest doing a stage or doing an internship with a beekeeper before getting into bees yourself. There's a lot of mistakes to learn before you. And it's cheaper to do it on someone else's dime or be under the wing of a pro.
Because they are somewhat fragile, I would guess, especially with our really, extreme weather conditions.
Extreme weather, for sure, is a factor to the diminishing populations of bees, but more so the parasites. There's the varroa mite, which is a parasitic mite that attaches to the bee's back and sucks the daylights out of it and kills it. And then there's another one, the hive beetle, that is coming up from the United States. It's in southern Quebec right now and moving north towards us. And if you're not feeding them properly in the fall to get through winter, for sure, it's a detriment to them. Lots of mistakes to be happening.
Well, that's interesting because I wanted to talk to you about some of the mistakes and some of the challenges. So can you tell us a bit about sort of the season of beekeeping? You've just put them back out in the field. We're in early May. So what's sort of the rhythm and the seasons of the beekeeping?
Just put them out right now. Well, they came out of cold storage or out of the root cellar, I guess about a month or so ago, a month and a half on the first warm days, and kept in a sheltered area, and they're out in the field now. Very important, all of the hives that are a little bit light, that's what we were doing this morning when we took you guys out. We added a little bit of food to the boxes there. We gave them a simple syrup. It's a sugar with water and diluted. Very important to keep them fed this time of year because the queen is about to start laying. The first pollen is coming in. Our Manitoba maples are in full bloom right now. The first dandelions are popping out. And as soon as that queen has pollen, she's going to start laying, and we have to make sure that they're nice and strong and fed. And as soon as they do start laying, it's important to add boxes and make sure that the population doesn't get too dense in the hive. Otherwise, they'll make a new queen and swarm. You don't want that. We got to give them room. Unless you want to make a new hive, then you force a new queen and you pull out the new queen cell and put it into a nuke box and let her develop. And then the honey flow follows right after that. As soon as the first clover comes out, that's when, the honey flow is really starting. You're talking early to, throughout all of June. As soon as the flowers really start blooming, that's when that nectar comes in, and we got to add boxes for more honey.
How often do you need to take out the honey and check, or actually bring the honey out? How often do you need to do that?
It depends on the honey flow. If it's a very, very dry season, it'll be later in the season, probably, late July through August will be our harvests. But if it's an early warm season with lots of water and lots of flowers, we got to be on top of it. If we see that the population is very, very high, the bees are doing super well, we got to be adding boxes or swapping boxes out. If they're full of honey, we'll pull them off and give them fresh, empty boxes for them to work on. What
are some mistakes that people might typically make if they're, trying to house bees? Is that the right term?
For sure, housing bees. Mistake number one is not giving them enough room whenever the season really does kick off. If you kind of neglect, if you got other things going on the farm, We're busy planting and, we forgot to add boxes and, we got a swarm. That means half the population will leave. The old queen will feel far too restrained, too much population in the hive, so she'll leave with half the population and leave behind eggs that the worker bees will make into a new queen. And that you're just losing population, you're losing production there when half the population leaves. So it's important to give them more room whenever they need it.
And when they leave, they don't just go to the other field, they really go?
It entirely depends. There are scout bees that are sent out beforehand to scout out possible options for a new home. Usually it'll be a hollowed out tree or a cavity in a wall somewhere. But very often on the way to said new location, they'll congregate on a branch, usually up higher, like 10, 20 feet up in a tree. And you'll see a big ball of bees all around the queen protecting her. And that's an opportunity to harvest a swarm.
And that's how the whole story started for your dad.
Yeah, that's right.
And any other classic mistakes?
Yeah, for sure. Come late August through September, we have to look at populations of the varroa mite. That's a parasite that will kill the bees. If the populations are high, we have to go in there and treat them and give the bees a fighting chance to survive the winter. If we don't do anything, that's when the population just drops too low and they don't survive the winter. Also very important late season to feed your bees. We're stealing all the honey. That's what we want, is a sweet honey. But historically, bees harvest that honey for themselves to make it through the winter. We either have to leave a box and a half full of honey for them, or we have to feed them. For sure, late season, we'll give them a simple syrup. Some of the old timers don't like doing that. They'll prefer to give them just leave honey for them. Whereas we take most of the honey, leave them some, and then we feed them. Through October is when we feed them.
And then they're put away for the winter in a colder space?
Yeah, either
kind of dormant?
Either quite literally a cold storage where they're kept at a steady temperature, usually somewhere between 4 to 10 degrees Celsius, depending on how you like it, or a root cellar where, again, temperatures are steady. Very important to have them ventilated whenever you do keep them in storage. They need air movement. Some of the old timers keep them outside yet, but the fluctuations in temperature through our modern winters is hard on them. As soon as they get warm days, they get active, and then back down to minus 20. They don't like that.
Well, thanks so much for telling us all about bees, Phil.
Yeah, that's it for today. Time is honey,
Okay, thanks so much.
Now, the Gleaner's news editor, Sarah Rennie, joins us. She has been talking with a collection of people, from producers to researchers, about different species of bees and the ways farmers are working to protect these important pollinators, as well as some of the impacts farming practices can have on bee populations. Welcome, Sarah.
Hello.
What's up with bees?
There's a lot, actually. We maybe thought that this was going to be a simple topic, and it turns out that it's quite an in-depth issue, with farmers right now, because they need bees as pollinators, and at the same time, they're doing some things on their farms that are maybe not the best practices for the lives of bees. So it's complicated.
And so when you talk to farmers, I guess there are two kinds: those who are very reliant on bees and wild insects in general for the pollination of their crops, fruits in particular, and those, because they're growing other crops that impact the habitat of bees and where they live and how they move around and the sources of food and the flowers and the fruits. So let's start with the producers who depend on the bees for getting a crop onto the branches, and then of course into the baskets and out to consumers.
Mm-hmm. So I spoke with Greg Edwards, who runs an organic blueberry farm on Covey Hill in Havelock. And he's also a brand new beekeeper. So last year was his first year keeping bees. They started with 5 hives, and they had 2 that didn't survive the winter, but they had 3 that did, and they're very healthy hives. I had a chance to go and visit them yesterday, actually, and watch them open up their hives and meet their bees, those sorts of things. So it was a really interesting experience. They had an agronome there as well who was talking about the health of their hives. And bees are just incredibly interesting things to watch, really, is what I've sort of learned from this podcast episode. Greg and I talked specifically about the importance of bees for blueberry production and for pollination. And so I'll let you hear a little bit about what he had to say about that.
Pollination is really important. First of all, 35 to 40% of all food depends on pollinators for production. Fruit, vegetables, seeds, nuts, all kinds of biodiversity. But 35% of food depends on pollination. And what does pollination do? At the absolute opportune time when blossoms are at their best, for blueberries, apples, fruit size is improved, yield is improved, ripening is improved, shelf life is improved, everything is, seed life is improved. And then there are the other aspect of keeping bees where birds, wildlife, soil protection, biodiversity, which is a big word today and a huge objective with the climate change that we're living with and the change of agricultural practice. And bees help keep the entire ecosystem up and running.
Yeah, so they're quite essential then.
They're absolutely essential. Absolutely essential. Timing is really important for pollination, for the people who bring bees into their orchards, into their bee yards, when flowers have to be in full bloom, not too early, not too late, and have good sunny, warm weather. Bees like warm weather. Like if I went out to our hives right now, the temperature here this morning, beautiful sunshine. Our bees have a southeastern exposure at their entrance, and it is now 14, 16 degrees Celsius. The bees will be out. Our bees will not come out of that hive until we reach 12 degrees Celsius.
Yeah, so it's been a rough spring for them too then, because
it's been a very rough spring. We brought our bees home on the 9th of April from an apple storage facility and been monitoring them daily. And there have been very few mornings where these guys are out prior to 11 o'clock because it's been too cold.
Wow.
It's been too cold. Now, yesterday afternoon at 2 o'clock, they weren't out. At 4 o'clock, they were out.
So they've got very good little internal temperature monitoring system.
Oh, yes. These guys, they are absolutely amazing. They're absolutely amazing to watch and to see how they operate.
So Greg and I also spoke about the interaction between honeybees and native bees, such as bumblebees, and some of the challenges that come with beekeeping, especially, now that he's come through his first year and he's looking at expanding the number of hives that he has on his farm.
Apple trees like honeybees. Blueberries like honeybees and bumblebees because the flower on a blueberry plant is very long and deep. And some of the worker bees cannot get into them, whereas the bumblebee can. So they will both work together. They become pretty good friends, and they pollinate together.
Wow, you hear about that, about bumblebees and honeybees being friends, because they sort of outcompete each other sometimes.
Well, they compete a little, but the bumblebees will not go to the colony. And when you see them out in the field, they're happily doing their thing. We haven't had any conflict around here that has been noticeable.
Okay, and so the bees that you've brought in, are those honeybees?
We have our colonies are honeybees. Apis, I don't know if I can say this right. Apis mellifera, I think is the biological term.
Okay, are you going to collect honey as well, or is it just for the bees?
We extracted honey last year, and for the first time around, it's quite an experience. So it is. And no shortage of stickiness, but it was great fun. Bees are amazing to watch. They're a society all of their own, and they're amazing little creatures. They require a lot of work. They require a lot of attention, and there's some pretty good challenges. But with I think the number one game that I've found by talking to agronomes and researchers in the bee world is to keep on top of the game and not to become too big, but stay on top of it. Do those inspections regularly and, keep them healthy. Last summer was difficult. It was very, very dry. So the flower population literally dried up come the 1st of August. And so there we were watering bees. Never in my life did I ever think that I'd be watering an insect. But we had waterers set up and water. We did that change water every day, and we managed to get through the season. But these challenges, the varroa mite, which is that ugly little parasite, pesticides, loss of habitat, climate change, where the weather is just up and down like a yo-yo. We all know that. And when we're in drought, you have huge flower decline.
So it's hard to get optimal conditions then.
Now, I've only been in this a year. I'm just starting year 2. So, I mean, everything was great. Here we work with an agronome, and everything was wonderful here until the severe drought arrived the 1st of August, that we managed to pull through.
And the bees, they survived the winter okay? They stayed with you?
Yeah, we had our bees indoors into a controlled climate, and we lost 1 of 5 hives. It was a very weak hive as it went in. We had every belief that we would lose it, and we did. But we're hearing through the MAPAC and through our agronome that bee loss was quite high in some parts of the province.
Yeah, I guess that's sort of the other major story with all of this too, is that as the hives aren't doing as well year after year, it's just becoming more and more complicated too.
Becoming more and more difficult. The varroa mite is the leading difficulty. So we have to monitor for the varroa mite. You have to treat for the varroa mite. We treated 3 times last year on a routine basis. We did inspection between our agronome and ourselves. We didn't find any, but the research says every beehive has a varroa mite in it. And the varroa mite causes viruses, and it does now what's the proper term? Deformed wings. And so bees don't fly, so there's no foraging. So it becomes a bit of a difficulty, the varroa mite.
So bees in agriculture are facing a number of challenges, as Greg pointed out. There's the infestation of the varroa mite. There are other health issues that come from bees. Obviously don't build hives like we build for them and put them 10 in a row. And I think one of the things, there are beekeepers like Greg who have their own hives so that they can manage the situation. There are also beekeepers that have hundreds of hives that they put on a truck and they move off to an orchard because the person who runs the farmer that runs the orchard doesn't want to have to deal with managing the bees at the same time. So there are a lot of stresses on a bee from their utility, right? We're in a way imposing those stresses. And like with many other types of production, maple production, for example, where we've used modern technology to enhance production, we have to be very careful about what we do and how we do that, and it's learning as we go along. So, what are some of the other challenges, health problems that are afflicting honeybees and therefore their capacity to produce both honey and also to pollinate for the farmers that need it?
Well, certainly there's habitat loss and certain issues around that as well. So it's just harder. But mostly for honeybees, it really is cold winters, late springs, those sorts of things can cause problems for hives. And as Greg mentioned, that mite is just becoming kind of a nightmare, I think, for a lot of bee producers.
So in Quebec as elsewhere, there are also other pollinators. Several species of bumblebees are very important. Interesting to note that in a lot of greenhouses, they use bumblebees. They build little mini hives, little boxes, and the bumblebees pollinate the tomatoes and the cucumbers and the green peppers, and they're extremely useful even if they don't produce honey. But out in the wild, the natural habitat, they're under a lot of stress because many of the areas where they exist, there's farming activities going along, and modern practice is not to let wild plants proliferate because, of course, that's weeds and It costs money to control them, but that's also the habitat for bumblebees and other insects. And so the flower strips in particular along the edges of fields appear to be a promising solution that can help occupy space that would otherwise be covered with weeds, and also then give the bumblebees and other pollinators some food and some space to breathe, provided the right flowers are chosen.
So who would have known that, bee nutrition was so important? But I spoke with Amélie Morin, who's a doctoral candidate at the Université de Laval, who's studying how the choice of flowers influences the diet, health, and resilience of the bourdons, or bumblebees, specifically in Quebec. So she started in this project with her master's degree, and she demonstrated that these strips actually attract a greater abundance and diversity of bumblebees. She's now working, they fast-tracked her into a PhD, actually, and it's allowing her to continue her research on bumblebee nutrition and health. So I asked her, basically just to try to describe her research, and here's some of what she had to say.
I love to talk about the bees in my project. I started with a master project on the flower strips that were already on the farms in Montérégie, and we found that the flower strips are working. So we have more bumblebees and more species. So it was really interesting. And then I continued to my PhD because the producers were wondering what they should sow. So that's the question that everyone asked me. So which flowers are the best for the bees? So that's how my PhD project started. So I have three different parts. The first part is to collect the pollen on the flowers. Then we analyze the nutritional values of this pollen, so we can know which flowers have a lot of proteins, which one have more vitamins, so things like that, and that can help us obviously to know the values of these flowers. So that's the first part. The second part is about the endangered bumblebee species. So we catch them and we make them pass a series of health tests. So the first one is the behavior. We look at their behavior to know if it's normal, is it changed. We look also at their health. So we take feces, so we collect them and we check if they have a pathogen. And the last test is to collect the pollen from their pollen basket, so on their leg. And same thing, we can know did this bumblebee collect high protein flower pollens or things like that. So we can know their health, if they're lacking some nutrients, things like that, and we can compare to bumblebee species that are doing okay right now.
So there's about 25 bumblebee species in Quebec?
Yeah, about 25. So yes, we have a lot of different bumblebees, and that does not account for all of our solitary indigenous bees. So we have tons of species, and they're all important to pollinate our cultures. So yeah, we specifically work on bumblebees because they're bigger, obviously, so we can capture them with a net. We can cool them down a little bit on ice because they're more able to survive on the ice because they're bigger and they have a lot of hair. And then we can do these tests and release them, which could not right now be possible for all our small bees that are difficult to see in the flower strips. And yeah, the bumblebees have endangered laws, so we have funding for them. But obviously, all the bees are important.
But then there's a difference between a bumblebee and a honeybee, for example, because all honeybees are imported. That's the case?
Yeah, well, honeybees, of course, are super important too, good pollinators, but they are not indigenous here. And unfortunately, they are very good competitive species. They can infer a decline in other of our bees. They can also transfer pathogens. So for us, we are really focusing on the conservation of indigenous bees.
So Amelie's work is incredibly interesting, and it mainly focuses on the nutritional quality of flowers, to hopefully be able to guide farmers in planting and growing healthy nutritional flowers, shrubs, trees to help native bee populations near their fields. So I asked her about how they determine which flowers are best, how they determine the nutritional value, those sorts of things. And we got into a bit of an interesting conversation about whether or not there's something called a fast food flower. And there are fast food flowers. Dandelions, for example.
I got lots of those.
Yep. Apparently dandelions are just like candy. They're just sugar and fat. So we'll let her explain that.
So right now it's really about attractiveness. So we see a bumblebee on a flower and we're like, wow, that's a great flower. We should sown that one. So right now we're thinking, okay, but does this really respond to the needs of the bumblebees? So that's one step further, to just make sure that bumblebees have what they need to have a good reproductions and a good health in general.
Okay, and so all flowers then are not the same. Some have more protein and some are less healthy?
Yeah, exactly, like human food. And it's really complicated. Like the human food, you need the fat. So it's not, you cannot just say, reduce the fat. You need a little bit of fat. So it's all the same complexness. But yeah, exactly. Some flowers have a lot of proteins. So you can compare them to, I don't know, like a steak or a tofu, something really rich in proteins. So that's really good for the beginning of the season when they lay eggs. So the eggs really need these proteins to have a good reproduction. And then you have some flowers that can help reduce pathogens. So these flowers, you can see the pathogens leave the body earlier, or it can help fight. So I don't know, like antibiotics or things like that for us, the humans. So these are really nice for bumblebee species or some sites that are more attacked by pathogens, for example. And yeah, we're trying to find flowers that have a good ratios of all of these. Obviously, there's not one flower, but like for human health, we're seeing that like Guide alimentaire canadien, like the having flowers rich in proteins, having flowers rich in vitamins, so like the fruits or the veggies, and having flowers that helps with the pathogens. So something optimized and a good mix.
So then if there are like healthy flowers, are there also sort of maybe less healthy flowers, or like fast food flowers, if we're going to go with that metaphor of human food as well?
Yeah, exactly. There are some that we think are more fast food flowers. So for instance, from the beginning, our indigenous flowers are the best ones. So these flowers have evolved with our bees from the past 10,000 of years. So they answer their needs really well. So all of the non-indigenous ones are the ones that we think, maybe some of them will be more fast food flowers. And like I said, it's always complex, so I don't want to point to flower and say these ones are really bad. But for instance, the dandelion, that's a popular one for the beginning of the seasons, but bumblebees fed only 100% on dandelion could not produce eggs and reproduce because the lack of proteins. So if you combine dandelion with for instance, right now it's the maples that are flowering. These are really rich in proteins, and the dandelion could help support. But dandelion alone could not help queens to produce eggs. So it could be somewhat of a fast food flowers, so the one that are really lacking proteins are really rich in fat. So you say, yeah, well, one flower rich in fat in a day, that's okay. But if there's only that, then it's going to be more difficult. Yeah.
Okay. So how do you go about getting your samples then?
Yeah, well, that's really difficult. So I gotta say, bees are really more efficient than humans to collect pollen. So sometimes we use the bumblebee. So we see, for instance, a culture full flowering apples, for example. So we'll use the bees present that already have pollen. But otherwise, more often we use little tools, super small, and we try to make the little pollen grain in a little tube. So yeah, we developed a method that we can see the nutrients with just a little quantity of pollen, so that helps too.
Yeah, so you must be talking like microscopic amounts then.
Yeah, less than a gram. So it takes a full day minimum or a few days when the plant is really at its peak of flowering. So yeah, it's a challenge.
Do you have any preliminary results yet?
Yeah, at this point, we have a few analyses that are done. So, of course, we will have more recommendation, and the producers will be able to choose which one they like the best. So right now, we were really impressed by the trees and the shrubs, so flowering shrubs, obviously. So they have a ton of proteins in them. So like I said, the maple, salix, and all the little shrubs that we know. So when the producer are doing windbreaks, we try and talk to them into planting some species for the bees also, so the windbreaks can help also bees. But otherwise, in more indigenous plants, we have the goldenrod, asters, also the sunflowers are really good for pathogens. So right now they are the one that reduces the most the pathogens. Of course, the annual sunflower is harder to use for the producer. So we are trying to find non-annual sunflowers, so sunflowers perennial that could stay in the cultures and help. Yeah, so I think that would be my recommendations for now.
And like fruit trees as well, or?
Yeah, exactly. They're interesting in terms of proteins as well. So yeah, in terms of categories, I would say that trees, shrubs, that flowers are really rich in proteins. And then you have the flower family of the Asteraceae. So it's a family. So if you're unsure, so these one right now we think are more for the pathogens. So if you know on your farms you have more of trees and you have no Asteraceae, you could try and do a mix yourself and help the bees this way.
Okay, that's very, very interesting. It's a really different way of sort of thinking about even just the sort of biodynamics that are existing on a farm. When you start to think about the bees and how important they are. What about people who just have regular backyards? This would apply to them as well.
Yeah, exactly. So we're trying to see that at what do you already have. So for the farms, we have sometimes big superficies of something that already flowers, so let's use that, or same thing in the backyards or in your neighborhood. So what is already there and what could be lacking, so what nutrients could be lacking and what flower could complete that, instead of saying what you have there is not helpful or is not enough, or let's use what we have already and then just complete that.
Amelie's work is all very, very relevant to area farmers. So I asked her what led her to this research subject, and she explained that she used to actually be afraid of spiders and insects in the garden, and it wasn't really the bees that first drew her attention to this research subject at all. It was flowers. So I let her talk about that a little bit, and then I asked more specifically about how the farmers are actually involved in her research.
What interested me first was the flowers. So I love flowers. I have flowers at home. So I dive in this study not knowing, and it's a master's project, is 2 years. So I was like, that's going to be nice, a little flowers. And now I'm really invested in the bees and trying to protect them. So I would say that's also what I hope to achieve. I think we can really make a difference for these bees. So they live like under 1 kilometer radius. So when a farmer does something, it really helps the community. So you don't have to do something at the Quebec scale or something like that. You can really do something at your own scale. And I think we can really help the endangered species and try and save them. So that's really what we are trying to achieve. And I'm the one talking right now, but it's really the producers and the farmers that are doing the hard work. And my goal is only to answer the questions that they ask me to my best and try to with the science, help them do the best when they want to help. So yeah, that's it.
Now, I think it's important to note that too, that it is farmers and producers that they care a lot about the bees, because of course they need them.
Yeah, exactly. They are doing the hard work, and they are the one that started this project with their questions. So we are really only here so it's a project that was really created with them, and we make changes in the project with them. So when they ask, oh, is this flower good? Well, we go and collect the pollen of this flower. We don't collect the pollen of any flower. So we really adapt the science to answer the questions they are asking, and I think that really helps after the results to be implemented fast and at a larger scale. So yeah, that's how we see the science really to help.
So who knew about dandelions being candy for bees? I won't cut my lawn anymore. But I'm not sure my wife will let me get away with that one. But there are other challenges to bees and bumblebees from farming activities, in particular the use of pesticides, insecticides, which are designed for eliminating aphids and beetles and other types of insects that destroy the crop and are very useful when they are used, but they are also indiscriminate in some cases. And one of the ones that's been in the news a lot with relation to bees is the neonicotinoids, which we abbreviate as neonics because it's much easier to say. And those have been quite controversial. They're very useful to farmers. They've been banned in the EU. There's a lot of pros and cons on their use and how they do in fact impact insects like bees. So what's the realities of the use of pesticides and their impacts on bees?
That's a really vast subject as well, you know, the use of pesticides and the way that pesticides have been used traditionally without really having any awareness of what they would do in the larger environments. They're incredibly effective at what they do. So I spoke with Sascha MacIntosh-Hobson, who's an agronomist with the UniAg Cooperative. He works largely with field crops, and his experience with pesticides, the regulations around these treatments, and their impacts on native bee species as well as honeybees. And we talked about different kinds of pesticides, but we decided to focus on neonics at first because these have largely been associated with having devastating impacts on bee populations. And so here's some of what he had to say about these pesticides.
Neonicotinoids is a class of insecticide that targets essentially the nervous system of select insects, and some are more susceptible than others, of course. But it was pretty potent at what it did in controlling pest species in our ag fields. And this was developed in the 80s and really being put into practice in the 90s and flourishing really in the 2000s, if you want a timeline. And it's an interesting development because at the time, neonics were pretty much heralded as being a great innovation, not only economically for the farmer in terms of an easy way, because this was an insecticide coating a seed that they were simply sowing into their fields. So there was an economic incentive for the input and for the protection of the crop, but there was also, ironically enough, an environmental impact, a positive environmental impact as well, because at that time it was eliminating the large use of other insecticide treatments, which were often sprays, being applied to these fields at the time. So it's funny because, when this came out, it was quite a nice innovation in general, pushing ag forward in a number of facets. And like anything, though, it's extremely widespread, like it became in the 2000s and almost ubiquitously used for seed treatments. Of course, we start to see macro effects and off-target and collateral impacts that we never foresaw to begin with. So this is actually, and it's good because when we see these macro effects and these off-target impacts, it pushes the industry to continue improving, right? And to continue getting better. And we saw with neonics in particular, like an impact targeting bees, which obviously were never the target for these products. But once we saw the impact that was having on foraging bees, it became a problem that we needed to address. And we have since. So now neonics, it's been a number of years now that they've pretty much disappeared from field crop production because of regulations that we put into place where It was essentially banned except for a prescription from an agronomist, similar to atrazine. So you don't really see neonics on seeds anymore. You do, however, still have insecticide-treated seeds, but these are diamide insecticide treatments, which are much less toxic for bees. So this was a good push forward to address that problem. And of course, in Quebec, we're pushing that even further, because now even the diamide insecticide class of insecticide treatments on seed is essentially banned without a prescription from an agronomist.
So neonics aren't really being applied at this point broadly in the Chateauguay Valley, but in Quebec in general.
Yeah, exactly. So like if you look at a corn seed or a soybean seed with an insecticide treatment on it, you'll see it's a diamide, most likely diamide insecticide treatment. So not a neonicotinoid seed treatment.
Okay.
And the impact on bees is much different. Far less acute severity than what the neonics had. But again, this is another input that we're going to see a drastic reduction in because of the regulations that we're putting in place to limit their use. And really, an insecticide seed treatment has a very short lifespan. You know, it's within a month that treatment has essentially been dispersed in its little environment and is no longer useful. So the whole idea is, whether it's a fungicide you're treating on the seed, whether it's an insecticide you're treating on the seed, you're really controlling the target pest for the very early onset of that plant's life, for the little plantlet's life. And once it becomes a young plantlet, once it's basically a month into the plant's life, that treatment is no longer there really or useful, and it takes over on its own. So it's really a very specific timeline. And in Quebec, and why I think it's generally a good push to further regulate and further limit the use of an input, because we need to make sure that no matter, especially if there is an environmental impact on that input, it has to be justified in some sense. And early insect damage in crops in general across Quebec is very specific. I wouldn't say, we could say it's rare, but in certain situations it's common, but in most situations it's not common. So you really only need to be preventative with your insecticide treatments in very specific cases, and it certainly shouldn't be ubiquitously used across all circumstances, right? And I think this is what the Quebec government is trying to implement in its regulation to ensure that it's really only being used when it's needed, and it's not just being used systemically.
So Sascha and I also talked about bees and some of the issues facing bees when it comes to agriculture, and how people can make a difference in terms of helping bee populations on the farm and in their own backyard. I asked him, about bees and honeybees and why they're so susceptible to pesticide use.
That's another very interesting topic, because we have, I think in Quebec, southern Quebec alone, we have over 300 different bee species, right? And there's, of course, the honeybees that we all know of, which are managed colonies. These are wild species. And I'm sure they were probably setting the alarm off early because usually it's an economic impact that starts the alarm and that gets the social awareness going. But really, so if we look at, say, honeybees, which are managed colonies, they are steady to increasing these populations, right? If there's a bad winter, if something happens in a given season, you might see an impact on the population. And I would say pesticide exposure is not their big worry. There's a certain mite called the varroa destructor, which is the big impact that these guys contend with for their bee production. But the vast majority of species, of course, are wild bee species, right? And they are facing, of course, a number of problems. There's habitat loss, there's climate change impacting their environment, and of course, there's always intensive agriculture or insecticide use in agriculture that can impact them as well. But it's very interesting to look at these species as well, apart from managed colonies. And we do see that there's some groups that are on the decline. There's some groups that are steady. There's some groups of bees that have really adapted to urban environments. But it's definitely these wild species that we need to be thinking about more so if we're looking at ecological preservation and what we can do to mitigate impacts that we're having. And there's a variety of different that have been put into place, and that people can, of course, adhere to try to push that forward as well.
Mm-hmm. So is there anything that you do then, as an agronomist, or is there anything that you're doing to work with farmers to try to protect bees?
What we can all do, and I think the regulations that we're all putting into place progressively over time, I think the key is for everybody to understand why those regulations are put into place and to keep that in mind. And if we think about bees in particular, I mean, it's really when these bees are foraging that they're more susceptible, right? And I guess it's to be conscious that, okay, bees are foraging early to midday for the most part. By late afternoon, they're pretty much done foraging. It's getting cooler. Nectar has been depleted a little bit. Is it becoming too hot? Is it becoming too windy? So things that will detract from foraging, right? It's difficult because spraying a field is already tricky. Can't be too windy, can't be too hot. It can't be, depending on the product, of course, right? But the good thing is early in the morning, there's usually a dew, so it's not ideal. You want things to kind of dry up a little bit, the conditions are a little bit better. So, and certain sprays that we know can impact foraging bees, it will be on the label to say, okay, listen, this product needs to be sprayed later in the afternoon, in the evening, when it's cool, bees aren't foraging. And this is legally bound, of course. Anything that's found on a label is legally bound. And it's just for everybody to be aware of the limitations of the given product, to be aware of the environment we're in. And I think everybody is, for the most part, any producer is well aware of what this product is intended use for, what the restrictions are, right? And I think it's a combination of that and rules put into place, like the banning of neonics without a prescription or insecticides without a prescription. And I think these are going to continue to limit the impact we're having on native species.
So we've looked at somebody who's doing some research. We've talked to somebody who's working directly with farmers on the use of pesticides. Now there's also, living in our area, is Holly Dressel, who's an environmental activist on many fronts and has written for The Gleaner. And she's got some interesting things to say about the use of pesticides and the impact on bees and pollination.
Yeah, Holly is always an incredible person to speak to because she just has a vast, incredible experience and a lot of information that she can share. She's written a couple of books with David Suzuki. She does write occasionally for The Gleaner, and one of the articles she wrote in 2020 focused on a honey producer in Saint Stanislas de Kostka who lost his hives due to pesticide drift. So I spoke with Holly about this story, which doesn't seem to have been resolved as of yet, and the use of pesticides just in general and their impacts on bees. And she had a lot to say, but here's a little snippet.
I've written 3 books, 4 books really, but 3 books with David Suzuki about the environment. And I ended up doing a lot of research on biodiversity and toxics and things like that. And then I did a lot more other work, outside work as well, And you learn a lot when you're forced to do serious research. Some of these takes a year of research to do a book at least. And the films we did for the nature things would take 2 or 3 years. So at the end of that, you feel like you know something about biodiversity, a bit anyway. And one of the things I learned, of course, is how desperately we need pollinators in this world and how important they are to farmers. And the irony of the farmers being the major source of the death of pollinators, one of the major sources. There are others, obviously. So even 3 or 4 years ago, we had a local farmer, Joel Laberge in Saint Stanislas, who was the major honey producer in this area, or one of them. And he lost millions of bees one day to somebody, just what's called spray drift, somebody spraying their field nearby. Now, what the government will tell you is that pesticides that are lethal to pollinators like bees are very heavily regulated. They aren't really. There are rules about how to use them, but there's absolutely no oversight whether the rules are followed. And worst of all, there's no punishment for not following them. So nobody's looking, and nobody will get mad at you if you do it. So really, farmers are not, obligated to pay any attention to these rules. They get this long thing telling them how to use the spray, and most of them don't pay any attention. If they have a neighbor who's got bees and who tells them, my God, please don't spray when it's windy, and in fact, that is against the law. It is against the law to spray when ideally you're supposed to spray at night. There are other rules, and the government will point to these wonderful rules. But if nobody is enforcing them and nobody's being punished for ignoring them, they're not really rules. They are more like suggestions. And when people are in a hurry, and often farmers will job out the actual spraying. So they'll get a company to come in. Well, that guy's got 5 farms to do in one day or whatever, 1 week, and he's in a hurry, and he's got one more farm on his list, and the wind kicks up. You think he's not going to spray? He's going to spray, and the bees next door are all going to die. And what that happens, besides the fact that the crops won't get pollinated properly, it also means that the honey keepers, lose heart and give up. And most of them have gone out of business. Joel was one of the survivors, Joel LaBerge, who was trying. And he actually, when this happened to him, he actually took it to court. I don't know what happened. That was 3 years ago. I don't know what happened with this lawsuit, but he took it to court, and he didn't want to sue his neighbor. He wanted to sue the company. But the way the law system works, he had to sue his neighbor for negligence, basically. So that's what he did. And the idea was not that he would get any money or anything. You'd say, oh, he's doing it for the money. Are you kidding? Any settlement would not have made up for his loss, for starts. And the misery and the trouble of a court case and having a lawyer and all that, and the chances of him losing very high, etc. He did it for his son, who wanted to keep bees as well. He did it for everybody who's ever wanted to keep bees. He loved doing it. He said he wanted there to be honey in Quebec. And without somebody calling people to account, but, all this goes down to, okay, we should have better, more stringent rules, and everything gets more and more complicated, and there's more and more rules for the farmers to follow, and life gets heavier and more difficult. And it doesn't have to be. To me, the one thing I learned about biodiversity and chemical toxins is that if a chemical substance will kill an insect, it will hurt you. If a heavy metal will kill soil organisms, it will hurt you. We're all in this together. We are exactly like the other life forms on this planet, and particularly the ones that are closest to us, like, say, mammals. It's like, why is it more important to use these chemicals than to be safe and not use them? And a lot of farmers will say, well, I won't get the yields. Well, yeah, you will get different kinds of yields. What typically happens in organic growers, especially in bigger areas where there's large amounts of organic growers, say in India and places like that, where they can't afford a lot of chemicals, what typically happens is they have more crops and more diversity in their field. So they can have a lot of things going on in their field. They can be raising bees. If they're a rice farmer, they can have fish in the rice paddies and so on. And they end up that all that has to be figured out when you say, well, the rice yield is not as big as it would be if they'd used these chemicals that would kill the fish. Yeah, but they didn't get any protein, right? Well, we don't care about protein. We just care about yield per hectare. Well, we shouldn't, obviously, because the whole point of growing rice or whatever is food. So if you're killing one form of food to get another form of food, it's not a net gain. And all of this became more and more clear as you do research on all this stuff, is that we have to look at the bigger picture, not the smaller one.
I also asked Holly what exactly the pesticides do to bees, as well as how quickly these pesticides can appear on the market and how little we know about their different components and how they break down. I asked her directly about what something like a neonic would do to a bee before asking about the future and how farmers continue to use pesticides.
So basically, it either kills them outright, the way a nerve poison would us, and or any creature that takes it, or it messes up their nervous system, which means they can go home and fly home and seem normal, but they are confused. They can no longer maybe find the flowers. Maybe they can't find their way back to the hive. Maybe they don't know how to feed the young anymore. So there's both immediate and long-term effects. Well, imagine how evil it is to do that to something as lovely as a honeybee. Why would you do that? Well, because I'll get more yield per hectare in the farm next door. That's not a good enough reason. And I think most people would agree that that has to be rethought. And one of the problems with things like neonics, when you bring them out, is they only look at the thing that they were intended to do. In other words, does it kill pests in this particular crop? It never goes, well, what are the side effects?
Yeah. And neonics are definitely something that just, like, they sort of just came out and came onto the market.
Yeah, they came very fast. They do this typically with all these things when they can, because the newer a thing is, the less likely it is to have been studied by anybody except the company that makes it. And in fact, all of our safety data on neonics and dicamba and the rest of them comes from the actual companies that make it and have a vested interest in telling you it's okay. So there is nobody actually studying them. And even then, we know how dangerous they are. Even the people who are making money off selling them to you will admit that they're dangerous. So just imagine how dangerous they are. If we got a look at it and we didn't have a vested interest in telling you, well, it's probably not too bad. So neonics did arrive very quickly on the scene anyway. I think they were discovered quite a while ago. But the mass use of them on this level and in this way, and, you know, like coated seed, that's another horrible thing that is just accepted now. Do not buy coated seeds, because they don't have to one of the things about all these chemicals, including neonics, is we don't know anything about what's called the surfactants and the other chemicals that they use that are designed to make them, say, oily, so they'll spread and stick to the leaf and kill them, or that is designed to make them sprayable or whatever. They are not obligated to test those, to even tell you what they are. So we don't know what they may be. What's actually wrecking everything is maybe the non-active ingredients, and we don't even know. They're not obligated to test them or pay attention to them at all. We also don't know what these things do in concert with other things. And like, the thing about the world is it's complex, and everything interacts with everything else. So you put something out in your garden, and lo and behold, you know, something next to it dies because you've done something to disturb its soil or whatever. It's the same thing. These things have repercussions that you cannot imagine because of the complexity of the way the world intertwines. So if you throw one chemical out, much less 5, it's going to have obviously multiple effects, and the effects are just going to keep growing through the ecosystem. So these are not studied at all.
Up next, our reporter, Callan Forrester, speaks with Brandon Borland, a teacher at the Chateauguay Valley High School, who is working with students on a very special project to raise bees and make honey at the high school. They spoke about the origins of the project and why getting students and young people particularly involved is an important part of taking care of bees and local pollinators.
So today I'm here with Brandon. Thank you so much for being here today. We're here to talk a little bit about the project you have going on at CVR at the local high school. If you could start just by telling me a little bit about this beekeeping project that you have at CVR and sort of how that got started.
Originally, I think the idea was we were going to try and turn our campus into like a particularly eco-friendly one, lean into the fact that we had such a giant campus. And we had a coordinator. She got a grant, and we got our first beehive. And then together, well, actually, she already knew kind of how to take care of bees. Together, the science department, and I learned how to take care of a hive kind of from start to finish. That was a group that would have graduated in 2023, 2024. And then more grants have come our way. One in particular has to do with food. And so we kind of doubled down and replaced a hive that we had lost. It has been difficult in some ways because, the nature of an apiary, like a hive, there are some restrictions when it comes to working with kids and like allergens like that. We have to keep the hive on the roof of our school. That's really the only way we've come to get around most of the problems of, will somebody vandalize the hive, or is it a danger to anyone? But yeah, we have some ideas to make it, I guess, more interactive in the future. Funding. Actually, a lot of kids still don't know we have it. But those classes that do actually know about the hive, they've seen us harvest honey. They've learned about bees. It is a cool thing to have. And it's really good for the pollination around the campus.
You mentioned that this is a great learning tool for the kids. Plus, it's good for the environment around the school. The CVR is lucky that it has such a big campus. For you, what are some of the benefits that you've seen of having this sort of hands-on experience for the students?
We learn about things like, for example, invasive species, and then native species, and the non-native species, and then the kind of Venn diagram around that. Adults are always surprised to learn that honeybees are not native at all to North America. They have a really hard time here. And then you get a lot of kids that are just kind of amazed that we've got an insect, an animalia here that isn't native, but it's just so good for pollination in the environment.
So you're actually producing the honey. Are the kids able to sample the honey? Are you selling it? What goes on with this honey?
Yeah, we're being really good beekeepers and really bad at the same time. By that I mean we're being good beekeepers. The last time we had a large amount of honey, such a surplus that we took from the school, but we gave the honey to the staff on Staff Appreciation Day because it just seemed right. Everybody got 100 milliliter thing of honey.
I think you're very lucky at CVR that there, like I said, there is that big campus, so you're able to have projects like this. I think that's a really unique experience that not a lot of high schools offer.
We did offer some honey at a recent farmer's market. It was some that was left over, and trying to get a greenhouse club started that takes care of the bees all the time.
Wow. Well, it sounds like you have a lot of sort of green initiatives going on at CVR right now. I'm sure students are really excited about that. Thank you so much for being here today.
So a lot of information to take in, and some of it not so good. But I think the upside of this discussion is that we become much more aware of the impact of agriculture, and when we use technology, and particularly when it impacts on those things that are not directly agriculture, but on the side. So when we talk about honeybees and some of the difficulties, the knowledge that we've acquired is really helping to adjust the management practices, the applications, when it's done, taking into consideration that when you use some of this technology, there will be unintended consequences. So please manage that as best you can. As well as what I find very interesting, and we'll delve into this at a later episode, is about the use of new technologies, which will significantly reduce the use of broadcast pesticides, right, where they're sprayed across a whole field and therefore have a larger impact, and very much targeted using computers and AI to reduce the almost the spot applications. And that's going to be a very interesting evolution, and see how that works. But we still have to deal with the climate. This spring is a good example where it's drawn out, it's cool, it's cloudy. There's not a lot for the bees to forage, right, to go out and find the flowers and to pollinate. So they're sitting waiting in their hives, and that has an impact on their health. So we hope that it brightens up, and we hope that is then going to give us some more honey.
Mm-hmm. Because at the end of all of this, what we really like is that sweet stuff. It's pretty incredible. It's also incredibly healthy. And so it's certainly something that we definitely want to see continuing to happen. And it's fantastic to see just across the Chateauguay Valley all the different ways in which we are producing honey, from, our schools to, smaller hives to larger productions. I think there's a good future for our bees.
And as listeners are traveling around, when you see a little row of boxes off to the side next to a row of trees as a windbreak, those are beehives, and they've been placed there for the protective location. And of course, then the bees will fly out from there well over a kilometer away from those hives to go out and forage. And so that's why it's very important to look after the habitat that's all around and not just where the hives are located.
And of course, they bring back some of the pollen from those different things that they are pollinating, the apples, the blueberries, lavender plants, for example. And that also helps to flavor the honey. And it makes for a very delicious treat.
So there we go. Plant flowers, enjoy your honey.
Exactly.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for the latest episode of the Farm to Food podcast, presented to you by Desjardins. We will have lots more about farming and all things agri-food in the coming weeks, and we'd like to thank our partners for helping bring this initiative to life. The Livestock Breeders Association in Ormstown and Quinn Farm in Notre-Dame-de-Île-Perrot for promotional support.
This program is also made possible by the volunteer directors on the board of the Chateauguay Valley Community Information Services, non-profit social enterprise with charitable status. So please support these efforts by making a tax-deductible donation at farmtofood.ca.
The Farm to Food podcast has been made possible by the hard work and creative effort of the following people at The Gleaner: Hugh Maynard, publisher; Jackie Rourke, associate publisher; Sarah Rennie, news editor; Chantal Hortop, managing editor; Erica Taylor, copy editor; Stacey Pennington, audio production; Diana Chicky, sales and marketing; Jose Manal, office manager; Gail Elliott, administration; and myself, Callan Forrester, reporter.
And, of course, Farmer Phil. He'll be back in 2 weeks as part of our bi-weekly Farm to Food podcast with lots of interesting stories on the journey of food from the land to the kitchen table. Thanks for listening, and we appreciate your support for local journalism at farmtofood.ca.